Tonight on the Hinckley Report, Neil Gorsuch is nominated as Justice Scalia's successor.
As this process now moves to the Senate, I look forward to speaking with members from both sides of the aisle, to answering their questions and to hearing their concerns.
Will he pass muster with the U.S. Senate?
We have tools at our disposal to make sure we can get this nominee confirmed with 51 votes. And some of those options don't even involve going nuclear.
What do Utahns think of his conservative credentials?
Throughout his career, he has consistently demonstrated an abiding understanding of a judge's proper role to say what the law is, not what he might wish the law to be.
Senator Hatch played a pivotal role in this week's confirmation hearings. Can Trump's nominees be confirmed over the Democratic protests? Utah leaders respond to Trump's executive order on immigration. How are Utahns reacting to this controversial action? What will the impact be on our refugee population? The Utah State Legislature closes the second week of the session. What issues received the most attention? And what surprises may come? Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I am Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Brian King, Democratic State Representative, Tanya Vea, Vice President and General Manager of KSL, and Todd Weiler, Republican State Senator. So glad to have you all with us today. There's a lot to talk about. But we're going to start with an issue happening in Washington, D.C. that has had a big impact here in the state of Utah, and it's the executive order from President Trump barring refugees from coming to the United States for a period of time. Utah has been a little bit of an outlier in this issue. The governor has been, and the people in the state of Utah, because we have so many people that have spent time outside the country, and we have so many refugees here inside the state of Utah. Representative King, let's start with you first of all. How is this executive order being received in Utah?
Well, I'm gratified to see that it's not being received well. I think that in Utah, our Utah values are we welcome folks from other countries, especially those who are in distress, and that's what we're seeing with today's refugee crisis from various countries across the globe. So I'm grateful for the words of Governor Herbert when he came out and basically expressed a lot of skepticism about what President Trump did with that refugee order.
Mm-hmm. Senator Weiler, you've been looking at this, and our legislature has some issues, even though this is a federal issue, something we're looking at all the time in the state of Utah. What is the big issue with this? Is it the impact on refugees? Was it the way it was rolled out? Politics of it?
Well, I think the big difference is this is President Trump doing something instead of what President Obama did. We now know that President Obama stopped processing immigration visas from Iraq for 6 months, but he wasn't transparent about it. He didn't tell anybody in advance, this is what I'm doing, and there was no protest for it. So we have President Trump stopping processing some refugee visas. He's proposing 90 days or 120 days, which is less time than President Obama did, and we have protesters out in the street. Also, Chuck Schumer was saying just a few years ago on Twitter that we need to make sure people are who they say they are, that we need to make sure that the documents, that there's not the same passport being used for person after person. That's exactly what the Trump administration is saying, and now it's bad. When Obama was doing the same thing, it was good. And so there's a little bit of political hypocrisy going on here.
Not true. It's not true that under the Obama administration for 6 months they stopped the immigrants from Iraq. What they did is they felt that there was a renewed threat in light of a Bowling Green incident in 2011. There were a couple of arrests made in Bowling Green of individuals who were from that country who were shipping terrorist materials back to Iraq. And the Obama administration put in place more stringent controls on refugees, but they never stopped them. During that 6-month period, they reduced the flow. So it's just not true to say that this is the same as what Obama did.
And this executive order does not stop them either, because there is a valve in place for the Secretary of State or the Director of Homeland Security to process these applications. That's in the executive order, which I've read. It's only 4 pages long. Also, there is also an increased threat because last year, under President Obama, we identified that the U.S. government in code identified these 7 countries as countries of concern in terms of terrorism. So it's not that Trump's administration went out and picked on these Muslim countries. There are dozens of Muslim countries that are not affected by this executive order. It was the Obama administration that said these 7 countries are countries of concern and need to be singled out for terrorism concerns. So we also have a renewed threat now.
Well, so this executive order has already had some changes, right? So there are some issues with people with green cards, for example. They've rolled that back a little bit as well. And the question many people are asking, and Tanya, I can ask you about this for just a moment, is the cabinet's not even in place yet, right? And so some of these decisions are being made before everyone's in place, and maybe there's a little bit of discord because of that. As you've been watching this issue, particularly from the great seat you have on news in the state of Utah, talk about how this was rolled out and how much of this problem was just that, lack of people, lack of process.
A significant amount of it was lack of transparency in the way the process was rolled out, and whether that was because they didn't have people in place, although they had congressional staff working on it, seemingly, behind the scenes. So there are a lot of questions about the process, whether that was intentional or not. There are feelings on both sides of that. I think those are legitimate questions and things the press should definitely be looking into right now is what is the process, there's a lot of bad information out there right now coming from both sides of this. Misinformation. You talk about Bowling Green. Kellyanne Conway this morning was talking about a massacre in Bowling Green. It's bad information, false information, misinformation, a lie, whatever you want to call it. It's not valid. So when you're looking at information that's being so freely given out, including from the White House, that is not being properly vetted, that's very concerning.
So yeah, I noticed you didn't get into alternative facts necessarily. But that's what you're thinking. Okay,
Exactly.
so let me ask really quick. So on this issue right here, we've had some statements come out from religious leaders. The Catholic Diocese of Utah issued a statement. The LDS Church issued a statement as well. Both of those kind of went to process making sure that we are mindful of those that are fleeing terrible circumstances. It didn't really get to religious freedom in those particular statements this time, although the LDS Church in end of 2015 did say that. Representative, talk about that.
Well, listen, I think that Republicans have held themselves up for a long time, and President Trump has held himself up for a long time as being an advocate for religious liberty and religious freedom. What he's doing, though, is targeting one religious group, namely the Muslims, and saying, we are going to make sure that you have more difficult circumstances to come into the United States than Christians do. And he's been explicit about that. They want to say, well, it's not a Muslim ban, but they're clearly targeting Muslims. And I am very concerned about whether actions match up with words in terms of religious liberty.
So the executive order, which I've read, and I hope Representative King has read, never uses the term Muslim. And like I've already said, there's 24 Muslim-dominant countries that are not within the scope of this executive order. This order targets the 7 countries that the Obama administration identified in 2016 as countries of concern. And this executive order also has a provision for religious minorities in those countries who are being persecuted, that their applications would be processed first. And so if you're concerned about religious freedom, and if you're concerned about the persecution of religious minorities, that is covered in this executive order.
So let's get to the very specific Utah flavor of that order itself. A recent poll that Hinckley helped conduct with Dan Jones as the pollster in the Tribune, 55% of Utahns were opposed to a ban for refugees in particular coming. And we even have the governor yesterday, I don't know if you read the tweet, welcoming the kind of the last refugee family coming to the state of Utah. Tanya, why is Utah in this position right now? Why do we see our elected officials like Governor Herbert kind of being willing to step out in front of this?
I think there's a disconnect, actually, and I'm basing this on comments that we're getting from viewers. So forgive me if not on polling. It's not scientific, but it's real. With how state leadership in this case is willing to go out on a limb and say we don't necessarily agree with this, and sometimes in the general public there is an underlying sentiment that they do agree with this. So I'm curious to know where exactly that balance is. You have some good poll results on that, 55%. That's still a pretty substantive amount of people that do agree with this. And you know, when you talk about not a religious ban, it is mentioned as far as protecting Christianity, and that's concerning. I think that's concerning to religious leaders and to people like our governor, who we're a welcoming state for all religions and have been. And have had the LDS Church has done a great job, the Catholic Church has done a great job here of standing up for all religious liberty.
So I keep on hearing this term ban, and I think that the poll reflects that people are responding to what they're hearing in the liberal mainstream media and not actually reading the order. So this is a 90-day push the pause button. The first 3 years of the civil war in Syria, the Obama administration let in approximately 30 refugees a year. And then in the fourth year, in 2015, they increased that number to 1,600. And then last year, in 2016, it was over 13,000. And so we've, all of a sudden, we've increased, I can't even calculate the percentage increase that we went through in the last 2 years. What this executive order does primarily for the refugees from these 7 countries is we're going to press the pause button for 90 to 120 days, reevaluate where we are. If this ban goes further than 120 days, I will be speaking out against it. But if you read the executive order, there's some 90-day provisions, there's some 120-day provisions. Obama slowed the flow for 6 months and nobody said a word. I do think it's appropriate when we go from 30 to 1,600 in 2 years that we stop and make sure that everything is working as it should be working.
I think Senator Weiler makes a good point, but a little bit is parsing the language, and the White House itself has used the word ban. It reminds me a little bit of going back to the Clinton, what the definition of is. We're getting into a fight over a word as opposed to the intent.
The only indefinite portion of the ban is Syria. The other 6 countries, it's a 90 to 120 day.
When it's popular, Donald Trump wants credit for the word ban. When it's not popular, he wants to distance himself from it.
Okay, it's got to be the last word on this one. We have a new Supreme Court nominee. Let's talk about that. During the election in Utah, this was a very important point. When you talk to Utahns about what the issues were they cared about in the next president of the United States, they talked about whoever's going to pick the next Supreme Court justice. And as 40% of the Utahns said, that is an issue for me, and it's a key consideration. We have someone. Now, Representative King, you've actually argued before this new nominee. Please tell us about him and his approach.
Neil Gorsuch is a very distinguished, accomplished jurist. He's served on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals for about 10 years. I appear relatively frequently in my law practice before the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals and have argued a couple of cases before him. He's a very polite guy. He's civil. He is very strong into professionalism and expects that of the people who argue before him. I actually think that we could have done a lot worse with a Republican President Trump in office in terms of the Supreme Court nominee than Neil Gorsuch. He's going to face tough sledding in the Senate for various reasons, but from my perspective, although he's very conservative, he's not a wingnut. He's not somebody who is so far out in his feelings about jurisprudence that you can say that he's not qualified for the job.
You think Utahns are feeling like this was a good pick?
If I were in their shoes, I would think that based on what we've seen in terms of temperament from Donald Trump, we got lucky.
Senator, go ahead.
I did not vote for Donald Trump. I didn't campaign for Donald Trump. I was very leery of Donald Trump, but he's delivered here. A lot of conservatives plugged their nose and they voted for Donald Trump, and a lot of people like Brian King were saying, well, you don't know what you're going to get with him. Well, now we know what we got. We got an excellent, very conservative, brilliant jurist who will be confirmed by the United States Senate.
You don't see any problem?
There will be problems, but he will be confirmed.
Where are we going to get those votes?
Well, I don't know that he will be confirmed for this reason. The way that the Senate Republicans treated President Obama and his nomination of Merrick Garland was abominable. There's just no other word you can put on this. They basically stonewalled for 11 months because they were gambling that a Republican would be elected in 2016, and they got that. So I think that there are going to be most Democrats, enough that they can't get to the 60-vote threshold to confirm Neil Gorsuch, that are going to say, we're not going to vote for this guy. And we're not going to vote for him based on the principle that what was good for Republicans in 2016 and how they treated Merrick Garland, it no longer is good.
You don't think that's going to be the case?
This is apples and oranges. In modern history of presidential elections, we've never had a president with one foot out the door in the last months of his term bring forth a new nominee. With that said, Merrick Garland was a respectable person, and I think the Republicans took a very risky risk because Hillary Clinton would have nominated someone much more liberal than Merrick Garland, but it's a risk that paid off. And it's one thing to say on the last term with one foot out the door, we're not going to do this with an election pending. In fact, the primaries were underway. It's another thing in the first 2 weeks of a new president's administration to say, nope, no banana. So I think they're different scenarios.
Jason, Ted Cruz said in October, when it looked like Hillary Clinton was going to be elected, we will filibuster for 4 years anyone that Hillary brings up. So this idea that this was 1 foot out the door is just not accurate. It's just the way Republicans have been doing business for many, many months now.
And Ted Cruz does not speak for the entire United States Senate.
Well, what's clear, you got 52 Republicans, you've got some Democrats that have come over, so we're going to be watching these numbers very closely. What's interesting, Tanya, is it's been a long time since we've had a member of the Supreme Court that has actually heard cases from people in the West, right, from the 10th Circuit. So that's something. We've already seen him have some cases that he has heard dealing with the Ten Commandments in one of our public places here in the state of Utah. He even had a dissenting opinion on issues dealing with the Planned Parenthood funding in the state of Utah. So he understands some of these issues. How will that play for Utahns and people in the West knowing he understands these things?
Overwhelmingly positive. I think there's really a sense that Washington doesn't understand us. There's a disconnect and don't really listen, despite the fact that we also brag about having big voices there. So there is a little back and forth, but I think this will be a very positive thing for people in Utah. If you polled that now, I would assume that you would get very favorable results. I also believe that he'll be confirmed, and I just think that they're going to force it through. You know, I think Congress didn't do its job in Merrick Garland, and I hope they do their job, regardless of the outcome. It's not really about the outcome. If they don't like him, vote him down. They should have done that with Merrick Garland. They didn't. They should do it now.
One more for you, Tanya. The way this was rolled out was very interesting, right? As a member of the press, I'm just interested in how you saw this thing. You have both candidates there. It's almost like a reveal ceremony of some sort. As a member of the press, how did you view that? That's how the show that it was, you know, the big ceremony.
I'd have to say former member of the press. I do the business side now, but at running news organizations, you know, we have a TV and a radio station. I'm all about what's good for TV. So, you know, getting people and the public to engage in policy and in our process is a very difficult thing right now. So if dressing that up a little bit helps, there's nothing wrong with that. You know, I just don't see anything wrong with that. He's being criticized for something that he understands very well how to use media. Other politicians through history, other presidents through history, President Kennedy did a very good job of using television in its early stages of doing, you know, making a better use of that.
And wasn't there a former president that had like something outside in Chicago with Roman pillars? And oh wait, that was Obama. That's correct.
Okay. You know, getting people to care about public policy as much as they care about a change in Facebook policy is a good thing, not a bad thing.
That's a good point.
And I don't have a problem with the way he rolled it out. What I'm concerned about is that there be substance behind the pageant. And I'm not at all sure that with President Donald Trump, we have much substance behind the pageantry.
All right. Well, let's get to some other substantive things. Very interesting. The legislative session, today is the end of the second week. And people watch a certain thing in the state of Utah as it coincides with the legislature, and that is the air quality. All right. During the first few weeks of the legislative session, sometimes this happens, and it has been terrible. The first part of this year, in fact, we have a couple cities in the state of Utah where the worst in the entire country. Please talk about some of the legislation that is being introduced here this session to get to this issue.
Well, here's something that Senator Weiler and I can agree on. We're both very strong in advocating for measures that the legislature can take to improve our air quality. And from that perspective, we haven't had a better week, because air quality has been so horrible. And we've had people focusing on it. We had a bipartisan Clean Air Caucus press conference yesterday in which we talked about some of the bills that we're considering.
We need to hear about a couple of those.
Sure. Todd will tell you about his because he's sponsoring one.
Well, most of the air quality bills come from the House. I'm usually the floor sponsor in the Senate. But I want to be a realist, Jason. We are nipping at the heels of this problem because almost 60% of the gunk that you see today is coming out of our tailpipe emissions. It's 58%. Some people have it as low as 52%. Another 20% is coming from people heating their homes and their offices. And so we're at about 70 to 80% of that gunk is people, ordinary Utahns, living their lives. tailpipes. And unless the legislature says you can no longer drive your car and you can no longer heat your home and your office, we will continue to have these problems. So we're operating in this space of like 5 to 10% of the air. And the question is how onerous of regulations, how many businesses do you want to put out of business to reduce this gunk by 5%? And so we are doing what we can. The lowest hanging fruit on this problem was the wood burning ban that Governor Herbert proposed in his State of the State 2 years ago. And the backlash was incredible against it. And so Utahns always are looking for a scapegoat. Let's blame the refineries. Let's blame Kennecott. But the reality is they need to look in the mirror, because it's us driving our cars and heating our homes that is creating this gunk. There's a lid on the valley right now, and until that lid moves, everything that comes out of our tailpipes we're breathing.
There are some incremental things that we can do, Jason, to improve, and we are. We're taking measures, and it costs a lot of money to do this, but we're taking measures to convert all of our diesel buses over to natural gas, which will be much cleaner. We're making some effort to induce the refineries to move to Tier 3 gasoline, which is much cleaner burning gasoline, sooner rather than later. It's their decision in the end, and there's a limit on what we can do in terms of government action to force them to do that, but we're taking some measures to induce them to do it sooner.
So some of those are talking about some tax credits for electric vehicles, right, this session, work on solar panels inside the state, and also converting some school buses. Those are some we've heard.
But it isn't, Senator Weiler's correct when he says it's incremental. And the reality is the geography of our area ensures that we're going to have these inversions in the wintertime. And the reality is also that the air in Salt Lake Valley and across the Wasatch Front is cleaner today than it has been in decades. It's just that our awareness of the public health problems that that bad air causes has risen.
Okay, one last comment. Tanya, you're a transplant here?
No, I'm from here.
Oh, it's maybe the Salt Lake Valley we talked about. So this air quality has had an impact on you as well. So tell us, Utahns, this seems to be an issue that's kind of crossing party lines, right? We got a Republican and a Democrat right here talking about this.
Saying they agreed. We should just take a moment for a minute. It's a really serious issue, and it will affect people moving here. So I'm from here. I want to stay here. I love Utah, and won't stay here if we don't do something about the air, because I've developed asthma since living here, and it's something you can't escape. We're putting our kids out, and it just has to be a priority.
And here's the good news. Tier 3 fuel and Tier 3 cars, which is coming soon to a dealership near you, will produce 80% less pollutants than Tier 2 fuel and Tier 2 cars. So even if the legislature does nothing, and I'm not advocating that, our air is going to get cleaner every year for the next 10 years.
Okay. We don't want to lose you, Tanya.
No, Tier 3 is a very important step in that. So.
Okay, we have only a couple of minutes left, but a federal issue bleeding into the state. We had a couple resolutions yesterday in the legislature, one on Grand Staircase and one on Bears Ears. Let's talk about what those are. Representative, why don't you take the first one?
Sure. Well, the President Obama earlier this month, last month in January, said that he designated Bears Ears as a national monument. That created a tremendous backlash from our congressional delegation. All 6 members of the congressional delegation, the governor, the Senate president, the Speaker of the House, all condemn this action. The reality is that the polls that are taken suggest that about half the Utahns in this country say, we support Bears Ears as a national monument. I'm troubled by the degree to which our congressional delegation and the leadership of our state in the legislature and in the governor's office don't reflect those sentiments. And we took action in the legislature this week in the House to ask President Trump to rescind that national monument designation. That's wrong. It's a mistake. It doesn't reflect the will of the people of the state of Utah.
What's driving it then?
Well, what's driving it is political extremism. This is a stunt, a political stunt. This is grandstanding by the members of the Utah State House and the Utah State Senate who are on the Republican side of the aisle. And it doesn't, as I say, reflect how Utahns really feel.
Let's talk about the other. You can go comment there, and then let's talk about this.
President Obama could not even take a break from golfing in Hawaii to announce this designation. Just threw it up on a website while he's out there golfing in 70-degree weather, and ignored every single elected official from the city to the county to the state and on federal level who represents this area. Ignored every single one of them, and one single person with a stroke of a pen takes 1.4 million acres, which is larger than the state of Delaware, twice the size of Rhode Island. By the way, Escalante that President Clinton did without coming to Utah, 1.9 million acres. What these resolutions really call for is reducing that footprint. No one in the legislature disagrees that the Bears Ears themselves, that special sacred area needs to be protected. It's the extra million acres, and it's the footprint, and it's the process that he used. Representative Bishop worked on this issue for 3 years and introduced his PLI, and once he did, the Obama administration did everything they could to pull the carpet out from underneath it. It's the process, and it's the footprint. The footprint is too big.
Mm-hmm. So this is the public lands initiative you're talking about with Representative Bishop. Let's talk about this just a little more too, because this resolution on Bears Ears was to rescind the designation. Tanya, how significant is it that the sponsors of this resolution were the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate?
Significant. I think that's significant, and I'm also questioning how much it reflects the broader public sentiment about it. There is definitely a political will. Part of that, a large part of that, maybe the entirety of it, is because of how it happened, the executive order, as opposed to, we're seeing that, the same fight happening with what happened with President Obama on executive orders happening now with President Trump on executive orders. They tend to spite people being very passionate about things because they didn't feel like they had a say in it. So Representatives Bishop and Chaffetz spent 3 years, and they couldn't bring something forward that ended up resulting in anything meaningful. You have to question, if that would have happened, would we have had a designation?
Okay, we have only a couple seconds left. Since we have legislators here, what's a big issue we haven't heard about yet we're going to get to by the end of this session?
Oh, we'll get to this question about funding for public education, our budget issues.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've got hate crimes coming back. We've got a marijuana research bill on the docket. We've got juvenile justice reform, which is a huge one.
These are going to be big ones. We'll be watching closely. Thank you so much for being here today. The time goes too fast.
Thank you.
That's it for the Hinckley Report. For more political analysis and news of the week, check out our web extra online at kued.org/Hinckley Report. We'll see you next week. Good night.